The courtroom was packed, a sea of faces filled with anticipation, curiosity, and, for some, quiet judgment. The tension in the air was palpable, a charged silence broken only by the occasional rustling of papers or the faint whisper of an observer. At the center of it all stood a young black lawyer, her presence commanding but calm, her confidence like a quiet storm waiting to break. She adjusted her jacket, her gaze steady as she scanned the room. This was her moment, and she wasn't about to let the weight of prejudice and doubt keep her from seizing it. Her client, an elderly shop owner accused of fraud, sat nervously beside her, clutching the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His livelihood was on the line, and she had promised him that truth would prevail. She believed it too, even if the odds seemed stacked against her. Across the room, the opposing counsel, a seasoned litigator with years of courtroom victories under his belt, smirked smugly, as if the trial's outcome was already etched in stone. He had underestimated her, just like so many others had. The judge entered, and the court rose. As everyone settled, the lawyer felt the weight of every eye in the room bearing down on her. Some were curious, others skeptical, and a few openly dismissive. She could almost hear the unspoken doubts. Does she belong here? Can she handle the pressure? Her credentials, her years of study, and her proven track record meant little to those who judged her by appearances rather than merit. But she had faced worse before, and this moment was no different. She would let her work speak louder than their doubts. The proceedings began, and it wasn't long before the tension escalated. The opposing counsel wasted no time in setting the tone, peppering his arguments with subtle jabs that weren't just aimed at her case but at her very existence in the courtroom. He questioned her competence under the guise of legal strategy, his words wrapped in condescension. The audience murmured, a ripple of discomfort passing through the room as they recognized the undertone. Yet, the lawyer remained poised, her expression betraying no hint of the anger simmering beneath the surface. When it was her turn to speak, she rose slowly, deliberately. The room seemed to hold its breath. She began with a calm but firm voice, dismantling the opposing counsel's arguments with precision and clarity. Her words were not just a defense of her client, but a challenge to everyone who doubted her. The facts were on her side, and she wielded them like a sword, cutting through the biases that sought to undermine her. But just as she began to gain momentum, the opposing counsel interrupted, his tone sharp and dismissive. With all due respect, your arguments lack the depth and understanding this case requires. His words hung in the air, and a few people in the room exchanged uneasy glances. The comment was meant to rattle her, to belittle her in front of the judge and jury. The lawyer paused, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment when she would either falter under the weight of his words or rise above them. She took a deep breath, her mind racing with the right response not just for her client, but for herself, for everyone who had ever been made to feel small or insignificant. What she said next would leave the courtroom in stunned silence, a moment that would resonate far beyond those four walls. The room fell silent as the lawyer stood still, the weight of the opposing counsel's words lingering in the air. She didn't rush her response. Instead, she looked directly at him, holding his gaze for a moment longer than anyone expected. The pause wasn't hesitation, it was power. She let the silence speak volumes, forcing everyone in the room to feel the discomfort that came with his blatant attempt to diminish her. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but carrying an undeniable edge. With all due respect, she began, mimicking his condescending tone but adding a subtle layer of irony that wasn't lost on anyone. Depth and understanding come from careful analysis, not theatrics. If you'd like to engage in a debate based on facts and evidence, I'm happy to proceed. Otherwise, I suggest we focus on the case at hand. The murmurs in the room grew louder, a mix of approval and surprise rippling through the audience. The opposing counsel's smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by a flicker of irritation. But she didn't give him a chance to respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to the judge and jury, seamlessly continuing her argument as if the interruption had been a mere footnote in her presentation. As she spoke, her words painted a vivid picture of her client's character and the circumstances leading up to the accusations. She recounted how the elderly shop owner had spent decades serving his community, often extending credit to those in need, and going above and beyond to help his neighbors. She wove together a narrative of integrity and dedication, contrasting sharply with the prosecution's portrayal of him as a cunning opportunist. But even as she laid out the facts, she couldn't ignore the subtle tension in the room. She knew the biases weren't just about her client, they were about her too. The courtroom, like so many other spaces she had navigated, was a battlefield where she had to fight not just for justice but for her right to be taken seriously. Her mind flickered back to her journey here. Growing up, she had always been the one to question, to challenge, to push boundaries that others thought were set in stone. Her family didn't have much, but they instilled in her a sense of pride and resilience that carried her through the toughest moments. She remembered late nights studying by a dim lamp, the sound of her mother's encouragement echoing in her ears. She thought about the professors who doubted her, the colleagues who overlooked her, and the countless microaggressions she had endured along the way. Every one of those moments had prepared her for this. The judge called for a brief recess, and the courtroom buzzed with chatter as people began to file out. She sat down at the table beside her client, who gave her a look of quiet gratitude. "You're doing great," he said softly, his voice tinged with both hope and fear. She smiled at him, a rare moment of warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. Across the room, the opposing counsel was deep in conversation with his team, their expressions a mix of frustration and determination. She could sense they were recalibrating, looking for a new angle to discredit her and her client. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As she prepared her notes for the next session, a young intern approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me," the intern said, their voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say, that was incredible. The way you handled yourself up there, it was inspiring." She looked up, surprised but touched. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone kind but measured. She appreciated the sentiment, but she knew better than to let compliments distract her. There was still a long fight ahead. When the court reconvened, the opposing counsel wasted no time in launching his next attack. He introduced a piece of evidence that hadn't been previously disclosed, a move that sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. The judge allowed it, much to her dismay, and she quickly scanned the document, her mind racing to formulate a counter-strategy. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but she could see how it might sway the jury if left unchallenged. She stood to object, her voice firm and authoritative. "Your Honor, while this evidence may appear compelling on the surface, it lacks the foundational integrity required for admissibility. I request that the court carefully consider its relevance and validity before allowing it to influence the proceedings." The judge leaned forward, his expression thoughtful but non-committal. "Proceed with your argument," he said, giving her the floor. As she dissected the evidence, pointing out inconsistencies and gaps in its credibility, she could feel the weight of the room's attention on her. This was what she thrived on, the ability to turn the tide, to challenge assumptions, and to reveal the truth hidden beneath layers of doubt and prejudice. But even as she held the room captive, she knew this wasn't just about winning a case. This was about proving, once again, that she belonged here. The day ended with no clear resolution, the tension lingering like a storm cloud ready to break. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she caught a glimpse of the opposing counsel watching her. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense the grudging respect hidden behind his guarded facade. He knew she wasn't someone to underestimate. Outside the courthouse, the city buzzed with its usual chaos. She stood on the steps for a moment, taking a deep breath and letting the cool evening air wash over her. The fight was far from over, but she was ready. She had to be, not just for her client, but for everyone who was counting on her to stand tall in the face of adversity. What lay ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. The next morning, as the lawyer entered the courthouse, she could feel the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. The air seemed heavier, the murmurs among the gathered crowd louder than usual. Word had spread about the intensity of yesterday's proceedings, and now the case had become the talk of the courthouse. She adjusted her bag and straightened her jacket, projecting confidence even though she knew the path ahead was anything but easy. Inside, the courtroom felt different. There was an energy in the room that she couldn't quite place, a mixture of anticipation and unease. As she took her seat, she noticed a new face sitting in the back row, a reporter scribbling furiously in a notebook. The presence of the media added another layer of complexity, but she refused to let it rattle her. Her focus was on the client, who greeted her with a nervous nod. He looked tired, as if the weight of the accusations was draining him more with each passing day. The opposing counsel wasted no time diving into his next line of attack. He called a surprise witness, a former employee of the client's store. The witness, a young man with a nervous demeanor, seemed reluctant to testify. But under the sharp questioning of the opposing counsel, he began recounting vague incidents that painted the client in a questionable light. Each word felt like a jab, aimed not just at the client but at the lawyer's carefully constructed defense. She listened intently, her pen moving swiftly as she took notes. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she rose with quiet determination. Approaching the witness, she softened her tone, speaking as though they were the only two people in the room. "Thank you for being here today," she began, her voice calm and reassuring. "I know this must be difficult for you." The witness nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. She asked him about his time working at the store, steering the conversation toward the positive experiences he'd had. Slowly, she began to unravel the inconsistencies in his testimony, revealing that much of what he'd said under the opposing counsel's questioning was based on assumptions rather than facts. By the time she finished, the witness looked visibly relieved, as though a weight had been lifted from him. The opposing counsel, on the other hand, looked less than pleased. But the day's challenges were far from over. During a recess, the lawyer received an anonymous envelope delivered to her desk. Inside was a single piece of paper with a typed message: "Be careful who you trust." There was no signature, no indication of who might have sent it. Her heart raced as she read the words. Was it a warning? A threat? Or simply a mind game designed to throw her off balance? She slipped the note into her bag, unwilling to let anyone see her reaction. There wasn't time to dwell on it now. As much as the message unsettled her, she knew the real battle was still unfolding in the courtroom. When proceedings resumed, she noticed something she hadn't before: a pattern in the opposing counsel's strategy. He wasn't just attacking her client, he was subtly undermining her credibility at every turn. His questions and comments were laced with implications that she was inexperienced, overly emotional, or incapable of handling a case of this magnitude. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of scrutiny, but it stung nonetheless. She pushed through, countering his tactics with facts and composure. But deep down, she knew she was walking a tightrope. Every misstep, no matter how small, would be magnified in the eyes of the jury. And then there was the nagging question of the note. Who could have sent it, and why? Was it connected to the case, or was it something else entirely? Later that evening, as she reviewed her notes at home, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the case than met the eye. The evidence against her client was flimsy, but the prosecution's determination to push it forward suggested there was something bigger at play. She began digging deeper, combing through documents, witness statements, and anything else she could find. Her phone buzzed with a call from an old friend, a fellow lawyer who had worked on similar cases. "I heard about what happened in court today," they said. "You're making waves, but be careful. People don't like it when you disrupt their expectations." "What do you mean?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "There are whispers," the friend said cautiously. "This case. It's not just about your client. There's something beneath the surface, and not everyone wants it uncovered." The words sent a chill down her spine. She thanked her friend and hung up, her mind racing with possibilities. Could this be why the opposing counsel was so aggressive? Why the media had taken an interest? Why someone had sent her that note? The pieces didn't add up yet, but she was determined to find the connection. As she stared at her laptop screen, a realization struck her. The case wasn't just about defending her client's innocence, it was about exposing a deeper truth. And while the road ahead was fraught with challenges, she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't stop now. Too much was at stake. The courtroom was quieter than usual the next morning, but the tension was palpable. She could feel it in the way people shuffled in their seats, in the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly as she walked past. Something had shifted, and she wasn't sure if it was the case itself or the growing spotlight on her performance. The anonymous note from the previous day still lingered in her mind, a nagging presence she couldn't quite shake. But there was no time for distractions now. Today's proceedings were crucial. The opposing counsel began with his usual bravado, but she noticed his tone was sharper, more urgent. He presented another witness, a woman who claimed to have seen the client behaving suspiciously near the scene of the alleged incident. The witness's testimony was delivered with confidence, and for a moment, it seemed to sway the jury. But as the lawyer listened carefully, she caught subtle inconsistencies in the story, details that didn't align with the facts already on record. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached the witness with measured calm. She began by asking simple, direct questions about the events, gradually steering the conversation toward the discrepancies she had noticed. The witness started to falter, her earlier confidence giving way to uncertainty. By the time the lawyer pointed out the contradictions in her timeline, the courtroom was hanging on her every word. The witness stumbled through her answers, and it became clear that her account was far from reliable. But the victory was short-lived. As the court recessed for lunch, she was approached by a man she didn't recognize. He was older, with a weathered face and a cautious demeanor. "I need to speak with you," he said in a low voice, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. She hesitated, unsure of his intentions, but something in his expression told her he wasn't a threat. They found a quiet corner outside the courthouse, and he handed her a folder filled with documents. "I work for the company that's backing the prosecution," he said. "What they're doing, it's not right. They've been manipulating evidence, pulling strings behind the scenes." I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Her pulse quickened as she flipped through the pages. The documents detailed a series of communications and transactions that suggested a deliberate effort to frame her client. It was a bombshell if it could be verified. She thanked the man and promised to protect his identity, but as he walked away, she couldn't ignore the weight of what he had just handed her. This case was bigger than she had imagined. Back in the courtroom, she decided not to introduce the new evidence just yet. She needed to confirm its authenticity and determine the best way to use it without jeopardizing her client's case. But the knowledge of what she had discovered added a new layer of urgency to her work. Every move she made now felt like part of a larger puzzle, each piece bringing her closer to uncovering the truth. The opposing counsel seemed to sense that something had changed. His demeanor grew more aggressive, his attacks on her arguments more pointed. But she held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. She countered his points with precision, her voice steady and unwavering. The jury watched her closely, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. She could feel tide beginning to turn, but she knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. As the day drew to a close, the judge announced that closing arguments would begin the following morning. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the pressure was mounting. She spent the evening poring over the documents the whistleblower had given her, cross-referencing them with the case files and preparing her final argument. The pieces were starting to fit together, revealing a web of corruption and deceit that went far beyond her client's case. But even as she pieced together the evidence, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The note, the whistleblower, the growing attention on the case, it all felt connected, like threads in a larger tapestry she couldn't yet see. She double-checked the locks on her apartment door before sitting down at her desk, her heart pounding as she prepared for what could be the most pivotal day of her career. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back walls, their pens poised to capture every word. The opposing counsel delivered his closing argument with the same confidence he had displayed throughout the trial, painting her client as a manipulative figure who had taken advantage of others for personal gain. His words were sharp, calculated to leave a lasting impression on the jury. When it was her turn, she rose slowly, taking a moment to let the room settle. She began by reminding the jury of the presumption of innocence, the foundation of the justice system. Then, she carefully laid out her argument, weaving together the facts, the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, and the humanity of her client. Her voice was steady but passionate, her words resonating with a sincerity that was impossible to ignore. As she spoke, she saw the jury's faces shift. Doubt crept into their expressions, replacing the certainty that the opposing counsel had tried to instill. She ended her argument with a plea for justice, reminding them that their decision would not only determine her client's fate but also send a message about the integrity of the system they were entrusted to uphold. The judge dismissed the court, and the jury retired to deliberate. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as everyone waited for the verdict. But for her, the case wasn't just about the outcome, it was about the truth, and the fight to bring it to light. The storm was reaching its peak, and she could only hope she had done enough to weather it. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the jury exited, leaving behind an air of unresolved tension. The lawyer stayed seated, her hands clasped tightly together on the table. Her client sat beside her, shoulders hunched, his breathing shallow and rapid. She wanted to reassure him, but the weight of uncertainty pressed too heavily on her own chest. The deliberation could take hours or days, and the wait would be agonizing. She decided to step outside for some fresh air. As she pushed open the courthouse doors, the late afternoon sun hit her face, but its warmth did little to ease her nerves. Reporters were gathered just beyond the steps, their cameras poised and ready, but they seemed to sense that this was not the time for questions. She moved past them, heading toward a quiet corner of the plaza, hoping to gather her thoughts. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Pulling it out, she saw a number she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. The voice on the other end was low and deliberate, but unmistakably urgent. "I have information," the caller said. "About the case. About the people behind it. You need to meet me. Tonight." Her instinct was to hang up. This case had already spiraled far beyond the realm of the ordinary, and every new twist seemed more dangerous than the last. But something in the caller's tone made her pause. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice firm. "That's not important right now," the caller replied. "But if you want to know the truth, come to the coffee shop on 5th Street at 8 p.m. I'll explain everything." Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone, torn between skepticism and curiosity. Could this be another attempt to throw her off balance? Or was it a genuine lead that could change the course of the case? Either way, she knew she couldn't ignore it. By the time the jury reconvened, it was clear that no verdict would be reached that day. The judge dismissed everyone, instructing them to return the next morning. The delay only heightened the tension, leaving the courtroom buzzing with speculation. She gathered her things and prepared to leave, but as she stepped into the hallway, she noticed the opposing counsel watching her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of unease that hadn't been there before. That evening, as the clock approached 8 p.m., a.m., she arrived at the coffee shop on 5th Street. It was a modest, dimly lit place, the kind of spot where people came to disappear into their thoughts. She scanned the room and spotted a figure sitting in the farthest booth, a baseball cap pulled low over their face. Taking a deep breath, she approached. The person looked up as she slid into the seat across from them. It was the whistleblower from the courthouse. He looked even more nervous than before, his hands fidgeting with a napkin. "I didn't tell you everything earlier," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared. But after today, I can't keep quiet anymore." "What do you mean?" she asked, leaning in closer. "There's a group," he said. "They're tied to the prosecution. They've been using cases like this to cover up their own wrongdoings. Your client isn't just collateral damage, he's a threat to their operation. If you expose them, it won't just clear his name. It'll bring down the whole system they've built." Her heart raced as she processed his words. This wasn't just about one case, it was a battle against corruption on a scale she hadn't anticipated. But before she could ask more questions, the whistleblower froze. His eyes darted toward the door, where a man in a dark coat had just entered. "We're being watched," he whispered. "I have to go." He shoved a USB drive across the table before getting up and slipping out the back door. She sat there, stunned, as the man in the coat scanned the room. She slipped the drive into her bag and left a few minutes later, her mind racing with possibilities. Who was behind this group? How deep did their influence go? And most importantly, how could she prove it without endangering herself or her client? Back at home, she plugged the USB drive into her laptop. It contained a series of files, emails, financial records, and documents linking high-profile individuals to fraudulent activities. The evidence was damning, but it also put her in a precarious position. If the wrong people found out she had this information, the consequences could be dire. The next morning, she returned to the courthouse with a renewed sense of purpose. But as she walked through the doors, she noticed an unusual amount of security. A pair of officers stood by the courtroom entrance, their eyes scanning everyone who passed. It was as if they were waiting for something or someone. She tried to stay calm, but the tension was suffocating. As the jury filed back in, the courtroom fell silent. The judge's expression was unreadable as he called the session to order. But before the verdict could be announced, the opposing counsel stood up, his face pale. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I need to address the court. Privately." The room erupted into murmurs as the judge ordered a brief recess. The lawyer watched as the opposing counsel hurriedly conferred with the judge and a group of court officials. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the stakes had just been raised. And as much as she wanted answers, she knew that the storm was far from over. The courtroom was charged with an electric tension that was almost unbearable. The recess stretched longer than expected, and every person in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the proceedings to resume. She sat at the defense table, her mind racing through the implications of the opposing counsel's sudden move. What could he possibly have to say that would require such secrecy? The USB drive and its damning contents weighed heavily in her bag. She had spent half the night analyzing the files, piecing together the intricate web of corruption they revealed. It was a puzzle so large, so insidious, that it seemed almost impossible to dismantle. Finally, the judge returned, his face as unreadable as ever. He called the courtroom to order and motioned for the opposing counsel to speak. The man stood, his usual confidence replaced with visible unease. He adjusted his tie nervously before addressing the room. "Your Honor," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "in light of recent developments, I must inform the court that new evidence has come to my attention, evidence that challenges the integrity of this case." Gasps rippled through the room. She could feel the eyes of the jury, the spectators, and her client burning into her back. This was not the direction she had expected the day to go. As much as she wanted to interject, she held her composure, her instincts telling her to wait. The opposing counsel continued, his words deliberate. This evidence implicates parties outside of this courtroom, individuals who have used their power to influence the proceedings. I can no longer, in good conscience, continue with this case as it stands. The room erupted into chaos. Spectators whispered furiously, and even the judge seemed momentarily stunned. She could see the jury exchanging uncertain glances, their earlier confidence shaken. The opposing counsel sat down, his head bowed, and for the first time, she felt the weight of his humanity. He wasn't the villain she had painted him to be, at least not entirely. He was as much a pawn in this game as anyone else. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. This is a serious accusation, he said gravely. I will require a recess to review this new evidence. Court is adjourned until further notice. She barely had time to process what had happened before she was swarmed by reporters outside the courthouse. Questions flew at her from every direction, their urgency amplified by the revelations inside. She kept her responses measured, refusing to divulge anything that might compromise the case or her safety. Later that evening, she received another call from the whistleblower. His voice was frantic, filled with a fear she had never heard before. They know about the files, he said. I'm not safe anymore, and neither are you. Be careful who you trust. Before she could respond, the line went dead. The weight of his words settled on her like a heavy cloak. She knew the risks of exposing the truth, but this was no longer just about her client. It was about dismantling a system that thrived on manipulation and deceit. She couldn't back down now. The next morning, the courtroom was a different place. The judge, having reviewed the new evidence, called for an immediate dismissal of the charges against her client. The relief on her client's face was palpable, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to bask in the victory. But she knew this wasn't the end. As the courtroom emptied, the opposing counsel approached her. His expression was one of reluctant respect. You were right, he admitted. About everything. I don't know how you did it, but you've exposed something much bigger than this case. She didn't respond, unsure if his words were genuine or another ploy. Instead, she focused on her next steps. The files on the USB drive were too important to keep hidden. But they were also too dangerous to release carelessly. She needed to find the right platform, the right allies, to ensure the truth came out without putting more lives at risk. As she left the courthouse, a sense of unease lingered. The fight was far from over, and she knew that exposing the truth would make her a target. But for now, she had won a small, significant victory, and that was enough to keep her moving forward. Later that night, as she reviewed the files one last time, she noticed something she hadn't seen before: a hidden folder buried deep within the drive. Inside were photos, emails, and documents that linked the corruption to figures even higher up the chain than she had imagined. The stakes had just risen again, and she realized with chilling clarity that the battle she had thought was over was only beginning. The discovery of the hidden folder left her staring at the screen, her mind spinning with possibilities and fears. Each document she opened added another layer to the already intricate web of corruption she had uncovered. These weren't just small-time players or rogue elements, this was an entire network, with ties to influential figures she hadn't dared to suspect. Politicians, executives, even members of the judiciary, their names and actions were documented in chilling detail. It was overwhelming, but she knew what she had to do. The next morning, she reached out to a trusted investigative journalist she had worked with before. He had a reputation for exposing corruption and a network of resources to ensure the information would reach the right channels. Meeting him in a discreet location, she handed over the USB drive, explaining everything she had uncovered. "This is bigger than anything I've ever worked on," he admitted, his face grim as he scanned the files. "But you know what this means, right? If we go public with this, they'll come after everyone involved." She nodded, her resolve unwavering. I know the risks, but this can't stay hidden. People need to know the truth. Over the following weeks, the journalists worked tirelessly to verify the information and prepare a comprehensive expose. Meanwhile, she returned to her practice, trying to keep her life as normal as possible. But the tension was always there, a constant undercurrent in her daily routine. She began noticing subtle changes: a car parked outside her house for too long, strange clicks on her phone line. It was clear she was being watched. The expose hit the news like a bombshell. The journalist's story was thorough, supported by undeniable evidence from the USB drive. It named names, detailed schemes, and exposed a network of corruption that spanned multiple sectors. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Protests erupted, demands for accountability grew louder, and investigations were launched at the highest levels. But the fallout wasn't without consequences. Within days, she received anonymous threats, warning her to back off or face the repercussions. She reported them to the authorities, but she knew that protection was limited. These were powerful people with far-reaching influence. Despite the risks, she found unexpected allies. Other whistleblowers began to come forward, inspired by her courage and the journalist's work. Each new testimony added to the mounting pressure on those implicated in the expose. Slowly but surely, the cracks in the corrupt system began to widen. Her client, now fully exonerated, reached out to express his gratitude. "You didn't just save me," he told her. "You saved countless others who've been silenced or wrongfully accused. You gave us a voice." His words bolstered her determination to see this through. She worked with advocacy groups and legal experts to push for systemic reforms, using the momentum of the expose to demand changes that would prevent such corruption from taking root again. It was exhausting work, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Months later, as the dust began to settle, she found herself reflecting on the journey. The fight had taken a toll on her personal life, her career, and her sense of security, but it had also given her a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced overwhelming odds and come out stronger, not because she was fearless, but because she refused to let fear dictate her actions. One evening, as she walked through the city, she noticed a mural painted on the side of a building. It depicted a blindfolded woman holding a scale, a symbol of justice, with the words "Truth Prevails" written beneath. It brought a small, hopeful smile to her face. The fight for justice was never truly over, but this was a reminder that progress was possible, one step at a time. Back in her office, she returned to her desk to find a letter waiting for her. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and there was no return address. Opening it cautiously, she read the simple, handwritten note inside: "Thank you for having the courage to do what others couldn't. Keep fighting." She folded the note carefully and tucked it into a drawer. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder of why she had taken this path in the first place. No matter how daunting the challenges, the pursuit of justice was always worth it. With the case closed and the network of corruption unraveling, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The fight would continue in new forms, but for now, she was content to rest and recharge. The journey had been long and grueling, but it had also been transformative, revealing not just the flaws in the system, but the strength she had within herself to confront them. And so, with the city bustling outside her window and the quiet hum of determination in her heart, she prepared for whatever battles lay ahead, knowing that she was no longer the same person who had walked into that courtroom all those months ago. She was stronger, wiser, and more resolute than ever, ready to face the future with unwavering courage.